Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Spirit School. I am really excited to introduce a guest for you today, Emily Brant. How are you doing, Emily?
Hey Danielle, I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Amazing. I'll get you to introduce yourself in a second here. I'm going to read your intro and explain to the Spirit School listeners why you're here today, how I found you. I always like to give a bit of context to that. So, Emily Brant is an Indigenous writer, speaker, and mentor working in the intersection of personal development and decolonization. She is a Turtle Clan from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte First Nations. I don't think I said that right, but you can correct me after.
Close, close.
Emily is on a mission to decolonize the personal development and coaching industry and works with coaches, leaders, and all types of therapists and healers to create more inclusive spaces. At the heart of all of this is fostering communities where everyone feels seen, safe, and truly supported so that we can grow and rise together. I mean, how spirit school is this, Emily? Thank you for this work. Is this your elevator pitch? How do you describe out in the world when you go to a conference? Like, who is Emily? What does she stand for? How do you like to introduce yourself out in the wild?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's very hard. I think elevator pitches are very hard for me. And as Indigenous peoples in general, we tend to really take our time, expressing our identities, where we come from, what communities we grew up in or belong to, all of these things that make us who we are. So I think everything you've just shared about my clan and the community that I'm from, it's Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, so you were very close.
Thank you.
um, and the Ganyungeha or the Mohawk word is Tyandanega, and Gandeke, sorry, is the community that I'm from. But yeah, my quick kind of what I do in a nutshell in terms of my business is essentially on a mission to decolonize personal development, spirituality, and this whole realm of like coaching and self-development. And so whenever I say that, people are always like, "Ooh, it really piques people's interest." So I found that's kind of like the quickest way to introduce the work that I do in the world.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that because I was recently at the Indigenous Women in Entrepreneurship Conference in Vancouver, and I had an investor come want to know a bit more about my work because in Plenaria I had said that I take a week off a month, and he was like, every month? I'm like, yes, and he's like, tell me more about your work, and it was a 2 hour description because like, how do you describe mediumship? And we had a great conversation. And I was like, I don't know how to concise it because you have to have that context, right? We're storytellers by nature. So I agree with you on the elevator pitch, and it's a beautiful work that you're doing. To give a bit of context to how you came into my awareness, it was a targeted sponsored ad done right, which I've had a lot of those
Oh,
lately. Been getting some wicked Tupac gear.
nice.
The
Love
targeted
that.
ads are doing good. And across my feed came an opt-in for decolonizing your coaching business. And I thought that that really piqued my interest because I've had some, less savory experiences hiring
Mhm.
coaches and being in that coaching space that have definitely been a bit more orange flag. So it was very excited to see this type of resource come up. And when I downloaded it and read it, I sent it to my writer who's helping me write a book right now. I was like, look at this incredible work that she does. And I've been following your work ever since. And it's such a phenomenal opt-in, and I know it's only like one thing that you do out of a lot of different areas of work that you are involved in, but I'm so curious for you. We're going to share a link to this opt-in so other people can see it because I think it's necessary, needs to get out there. But what did you see in the space that you were like, this is needed, this is necessary? Like, what was the initiation for you in this?
Yeah, I love this question. And just to clarify for the folks listening, the opt-in is a free ebook. So it's that's what Danielle's referring to when she's saying the opt-in. So it's an ebook on decolonizing your coaching business and and then I have classes and courses that I teach around this topic. And how I came into doing this work is by having some of those much less than pleasant experiences, as you also alluded to. And it's almost like, how probably everyone listening to this podcast, we have spiritual awakenings, right? So I would say I had my spiritual awakening many, many years ago, but I sort of refer to this one as my decolonial awakening, where I realized just how assimilated I was and how steeped in the Canadian colonial culture. In other words, the pressure to just blend in and be as close to white as possible. which is obviously made easier by the fact that I have light skin. I have mixed ancestry. So I do have Algonquin, but also European ancestry on my mom's side. And then I'm Mohawk on my dad's side. But essentially, I think it was early 2022, I was beginning to get frustrated because I'd had my coaching business since 2019 and my podcast as well. So similar timeline as you, I think, in terms of
Mhm.
our podcasting and just working really hard away at my spiritual sort of manifestation, if you will, manifesting some really cool wins and things here and there, but it still felt like I wasn't achieving the level of success or reach in my business that I knew I could and that I knew I wanted. And I was doing all the things that all the coaches, especially business coaches and manifestation coaches, tell us to do, where I was like journaling and scripting my desires as if they were already here. I was doing the daily gratitude. I was doing affirmations in the mirror, like all the work, looking at my shadows, looking at past traumas that might be playing into all the things, but I wasn't looking at past traumas or current traumas or intergenerational ancestral traumas related to my indigeneity, because that part, like talking about colonialism or racism or assimilation, that is almost a no-no in these spiritual spaces that we often find ourselves in, right? It's very much like, oh no, that's low vibe or that's too negative. Don't focus on that. We're all one. We're all just like spirit. We're all souls. And so I was very much taught not to look at that stuff. And then in 2022, I had this moment of frustration. And funny enough, I had a reading with a psychic who was giving like an Akashic record type reading. And one of my questions for spirit through this reader was like, what's the key to my next level in business and in visibility and impact and income? Like, why am I, if I'm doing all the work, why am I so stuck? And so it was actually spirit that said, it's related to your self-worth and it's related to your Indigenous ancestry. And at first, when I heard that, because I'd been so assimilated for so long and just pretty much acting as any other Canadian white woman, I was like, what? Huh? Me? I'm not even like, I wasn't living on reserve anymore at this point. I was like, I don't even feel, I also had this feeling of I'm not even indigenous enough
Mhm.
to have this as an issue, because I was like, I'm not, quote unquote, visibly Indigenous. Yes, I've experienced plenty of racism, but not as bad as others. Um, and so just lots of like, what? This is can't be true for me. And then spirit said, well, that's part of it too, is that piece of not feeling enough
Yeah.
and not having reconciled with your own identities, right? Where I was basically operating from just half of who I am instead of integrating my whole being and really looking at what was there. And so that just opened up a huge can of worms. And I was like, all right, spirit, I'm gonna look into this. And I just sat, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but I just sat with the intention. And I think our intentions are so powerful, and can really guide us when we don't really have anyone else to guide us. So I just sat with intention and was like, all right, I'm going to meditate and see if I can connect with my ancestors on my Mohawk side and see what's up, what's there to heal, what's there to look at here. And of course, obviously, there was so much that came up. There was so many emotions, so much pain, so much loss, so much grief, so much trauma because of the impact of colonization and being so brutally disconnected, all of us, from our families, from our communities, from our language, everything that makes us who we are. And
Mhm.
so obviously this was a very emotional experience. And I was in a mastermind at the time, a business mastermind full of about 20 women, mostly white women, except for me and one other person in the group. And as I was moving through these really big emotions and essentially this identity crisis of realizing that I had abandoned my indigeneity for so many years, once I left the reserve to go to school and started experiencing a lot more racism, it just became easier to sort of blend in and deny that part of me.
Mhm.
But obviously that's painful, and reconciling with that's painful. So I brought this to the group that I was in because we brought personal stuff and emotional stuff there all the time. So I brought this into our group chat. We had a Voxer group chat. And I was like, hey, everyone, this is what I'm going through. This is essentially what's happening. It's super emotional. There's so much loss, so much grief, so much trauma. Because of the impact of colonization and being so brutally disconnected, all of us, from our families, from our communities, from our like racial stuff here and trauma and pain and grief of all that I've left behind because of colonialism. And the entire group chat, which was like such an active, buzzing group chat, just went completely silent. Like nobody responded to my message. The mentor, like the leader of the group, ended up heart reacting to the message and no reply. And that's when I was like, oh, wow. Oh, wow. And looking back on all the groups and spaces and retreats and things I'd been in over the years, I was like, actually, you know what? I don't think there is any spaces where that I've been a part of where it's like safe and people know how to have these conversations. So that was just a huge realization for me that people need to know how to have these conversations and make space for this work. There was instances before that as well, especially back in 2020 when we saw a lot of the, Black Lives Matter and that whole, I guess, movement. It feels odd calling it a movement, but that whole movement was really active
Yeah.
and really loud. And a lot of the spaces I was in were white dominated. And the coaches were literally telling us, like, oh, you don't have to post about that if it doesn't match, if it's not part of your brand and your values, like, you don't need to say anything. And I just thought that feels so wrong. We are in the business of improving people's lives and helping people grow. How can we not acknowledge racism and oppression and these things that obviously impact us as humans? Like, how can we just bypass this? But I didn't feel at that time that I was the person to lead the way on that. I actually had this kind of calling for a long time to do this work, but kept, like we tend to do, being afraid of the mission and almost like running away from it. But in that moment of just putting my heart and this big, huge thing out there and then being met with silence, and then later was met with like a bit of spiritual bypassing and gaslighting, it was like, okay, no, this work really, really needs to happen. And I guess I'm going to be the person to bring it into these spaces. So that's how I got here.
And you're doing a great job. I've told a couple friends I was interviewing you, and they're like, "Oh, I know her work." So you're obviously doing a really wonderful job. And there's so much I want to say that you just talked about, going back to the culture and like when when our connection is disrupted, it's interrupted, right? Because of colonization, we'll go back to that as well. But as you are, I don't know if you're like me where I can pendulum swing. It's like, hey, like there's a little bit of an injustice here, and I'm going to go really hard and far over this way. And then you kind of find your equilibrium after a while and you center yourself in your work. So I imagine you went through a bit of a journey, maybe similar to that. What did you find the reception was? Was it kind of crickets for a little while? Were people not knowing how to react to it? Or did you find people opening their arms to it?
Yeah, I love this question. Actually, I found the reception really great. I didn't intend at first to make any sort of offer out of it. I just started talking about it online and really from a place of like, I can't hold this in anymore. And I just need to start speaking truth. And so many people, especially people who are also Indigenous or folks of the global majority, would DM me or comment and be like, I resonate so much with this. And then my inbox was flooding with stories of experiences that people had had, experiences of harm or experiences of just not relating to some of the content in the spiritual spaces or in the personal development spaces. And I still get story after story after story in my inbox, but the reception from white leaders and space holders has also been really, really incredible too. As soon as I did put an offer out, which was the roundtable, it's my signature class where we just gather for a guards down, like honest heart to heart conversation about what's happening and what we need in order to feel safer and more seen and represented in spaces. That was actually really well received. So the first time I ever hosted it, which was back in 2022, I think like 20 something people signed up right away, which was huge, for me at that time. And each time we do it, now we're about to have it for the fifth time, it just grows and grows and grows. And now over 200 coaches have taken it, and over 50 coaches and leaders are in my signature program where we really implement the work, and then we have like live discussion about it. So it's been really well received, not by the people that I initially thought and hoped that I was going to get to work with,
Yeah.
which is an interesting thing, but it's
Yeah.
been really well received.
I feel that so hard because that's kind of where my brain was kind of going. I'm hoping to hear
Yeah.
that the people signed up from the
Yes.
spaces that influence this change and were part of that initiation, right?
Yeah. So my initial hope was that my initial thought, naive little Emily, was like, I'm going to work with leaders who are like dominating this industry, right? Like they're teaching, especially coaches. There's all these coaches that teach coaches, right? And then whatever they're teaching, those leaders and coaches are going on and emulating, learning from like a particular few mentors that are really, really dominant in the industry. And so I thought I would love to work closely with them. And we're going to really get into the nitty gritty and sort of overhaul and go through their programs and go through their work and go through their messaging. And then that's going to ripple out. And of course, those people have been actually the least willing to lean into this work because what they're doing is working. They're making a lot of money. They already have a lot of clients. They don't particularly care if an Indigenous or a trans person or a Black or brown person feels super great in their programs because those people aren't necessarily in their programs right now, at least not the ones who are kind of in tune with this need to decolonize.
Yeah.
Because I will say internalized colonization is also a big thing. And so I was an Indigenous person in those spaces at one point in time who wouldn't have necessarily cared if or noticed as much, if some of the things that I now really, really see as red flags if those things were happening, because again, that colonization gets really internalized.
Absolutely. I so appreciate this. And some of this language for my listenership may be like a little bit
Yeah.
new. So
Yes.
and we're going to be actually, maybe you don't know, and well, you do. I'm talking to the audience now. Like Emily knows, but I'm talking to the audience. But at the day that this is being released, it's Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada, which I think that they really missed the boat on. I think that they did this all wrong. They should not have given the government a day off to surf in Tofino like our prime minister does. Or, I think they should have kept people in the workplace and focused and centered a day on Indigenomics and bringing Indigenous people in with honorariums to educate, right? Kind of like get that education in the workplace. So it was a bit missed, but what I do love about is the language is starting to become a little bit more commonplace now. So, just for sake of like the listenership, when you say things like assimilation, some of these words that you're using, is there something that sticks out for you that maybe we can describe to the audience so that they can leave with expanded knowledge in one area? You can pick one.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I was thinking that too as I was saying it, that some of these words might be newer to folks. So happy to expand on them. I think the most important thing to understand is colonization and assimilation, because then internalized colonization, obviously, it's when you internalize the ideology. But colonization is really all about assimilation, which is essentially folks from Europe, states in Europe, coming to places like Turtle Island, like Canada, and deciding that their way of life, their way of living and knowing and being is superior. Their bodies, the way they look, everything about them is superior to Indigenous peoples, Black and brown peoples, and our ways of being. And so the goal was and is to assimilate and quote unquote, civilize I'm not going to say the awful names that they would have used and many still use, but to civilize the Indigenous population and make us, assimilate to their ways, to learn their language of English, to learn about and to follow Christianity and Catholicism rather than our own spiritual beliefs and core practices. And so that really, in many ways, of course, they very much succeeded. And so many Indigenous folks are disconnected from their language, from their ceremonies, from their rituals, from all the things that make us healthy and whole and connected and thriving. If and obviously people also just didn't survive, period, because it also was in addition to being a cultural genocide, a lot of actual genocide happened, maybe not in the traditional sense that we think of it, but also like through the malnourishment of being put in very unhealthy environments in schools and hospitals, and just really a lot of brutality. So essentially the process of colonization. And the one thing that I always teach people is that colonization is not like a one-time thing that happened a certain date in history. It's an ongoing process. So we're still in the process of colonization. It's still happening. Even though we do hear, we have the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and we all throw on an orange shirt and we acknowledge the pains of the past. But the reality is that these harms and these pains are still ongoing. We still have a lot of work to do. And so decolonization and uncolonizing is a process that also needs to be ongoing. And I always say it's going to be a lifelong journey.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for expanding on that. I know you talk about it in your work, and I just want to highlight people to this ebook as well, because one thing I teach a lot in mediumship is words and the vibration of the words, and being, tending to the words that leave our mouth when we're in vulnerable sittings with vulnerable populations. And so, one thing I love about your ebook is that you have like a definitions area where you talk about some of these more common terms that we're trying to normalize more. And I love that you added that into this ebook. So I'm going to direct people over there again as well.
Thank you.
One thing I wanted to go back to a little bit, which was just a story of resonance, like a story of, connecting with you on this. Because, I'm the second generation in my family out of the schools. And, I got to work in community. I didn't get to grow up in community, but I got to work with community through my past career. And that was the only reconnection work I really got to do. So I never felt like I should be at the front. I should be a voice for any of this, because who am I? Right? Like, yes, I'm First Nations, but I didn't get to grow up in the culture. I don't get to live anywhere near my grandmother's traditional territories. They don't exist anymore. So I just want to say that I too felt that, and I've never led with my indigeneity because of that in my entire career. I maybe mention it a little bit on my website, but I've never really led with it. And it was at a retreat in 2022 where my elder, who passed away a couple years ago, I had my whole retreat plan, and he came through in spirit the morning before our first circle, and he was like, teach them about like the medicine. I was like, I don't have permission to teach about the medicine. And he was like, just talk about tobacco. And I started crying. And I tell you, I ran this whole retreat like inspired by my ancestors, and like, on YouTube I'm holding up my tobacco, but I smoked cigarettes for 17 years, and I used to work for a race car team that was sponsored by cigarettes, so I got them for free, and I abused colonized tobacco my whole youth. And then I quit when I started working for our people, and a way for me to restore balance and reconcile my relationship with the medicine of tobacco has been to kind of like grow it myself and harvest it as medicine. So I ended up starting my retreat doing that, and I tell you, it was like this initiation that like my whole body of work shifted after that, and my whole focus. And I learned about, and it reminds me of you, like I learned about the work of like Dr. Dion Millian, who coined the term rematriation, which happened around that time as well, which is, centering, and it's a word, rematriation is a word observed specifically for Indigenous women to use only, and centering Indigenous women at the work of restoring balance in the spaces where patriarchy, perfectionism, hierarchies rules all. So, have you heard of that term? And I could just see so clearly how in your space you are actually living that.
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. I got chills and tears as you were sharing that, what your elder spoke through you and how it sparked that shift. And I'm so glad. I feel like there's so many ancestors around us in spirit just doing a happy dance with each and every one of us that reclaims, those pieces of our identity and brings it to the forefront, because that's something they didn't get an opportunity to do. So I just want to acknowledge you and honor you for that. I think that's super, super cool. And yet, no, I haven't heard that term or of that person. So that's really, really cool. Funny thing is, I had this whole, I don't know, I don't think we were connected at this point, but I had this sparked quite a debate online around this word matriarch, because there was a white woman selling a program called the matriarch. And
Mm.
the way that the program was marketed, it felt very unaware and insensitive. And so I had a lot of Indigenous folks DMing me being like, can you please bring attention to this? Can you call this out? Why is this happening? And so I had to kind of lead this whole conversation around why. Yes, anyone can use the word matriarch, of course, but it is like an initiation. It is a rite of passage. It is a very sacred thing in Indigenous communities. I wouldn't even feel right calling myself a matriarch unless somebody had sort of like bestowed that very term, that role that carries a lot of responsibilities. If they bestowed that on me, and then but to turn it into a program for profit, it just felt wrong. And so I had a whole online discussion, which sparked a lot of debate around that. But that term and that author that you mentioned would have been really helpful to reference. So I'll have to look into that more. That's really
I'm
cool.
very protective of it because I saw on a podcast, I think it was called To Be Magnetic, like they've already had non-Indigenous people try to use that term. So I'm being very protective of it because its original intent needs to be protected. And
Yes.
this is what I mean about that pendulum swing. We are the first generation to be able to claim our identities without being sent to a school,
Yeah.
right? So our generation is one that is probably a bit more heated on some of these topics, and the next generations will be able to kind of like reap that repair work benefit. So I get heated when I hear that because it's different if you want to use the word like matriation for, you know, sacred work or like ceremony work, but to capitalize on it, and I think that's probably the part that you feel and I feel even hearing it, that is, and that's what I saw in the coaching space, right? Was like this replicatability, which is kind of like MLM, right? It's like, can we duplicate this? Can we replicate this? It has to be replicatable, it has to be scalable, right? This kind of like keep scaling, keep growing, like keep getting bigger, 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 bigger.
Yeah.
And one thing that I noticed was the echo chamber, and this is how come I'm protective of like Indigenous people's work, right? Because you would like see class from one of these really big people, and then you go over to Instagram, and within a 24-hour period, people were reselling whatever they learned yesterday
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
And to me, you know, reciprocity is like my core value. It's my number one core value. And I can sense an extractor like that. And I think too, whenever I feel that extractive kind of behavior, it needs to be called out, right? So that's my riff if you want to jam on that with me, because I get really protective
Love
over
it.
this.
Yeah, I love it. I feel the same. And I love what you said about us being the first generation that can actually claim our identity without being sent to school. Because I think that's the first time I've actually like, I want to sit and let that really sink in, because it's true. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. And I was born in 1991. So, you know, like me or you could have been at one of those schools. And so it's not like ancient history. And it is that rematriation is, it's a very, yeah, it's a very sacred thing. And I love that you said you can sense an extractor right away. I think that's something I can sense, and that's something that my community members can sense as well. I don't want to say my community members, the members who tend to be drawn around my work, if you will, that they have that sense too, but they can't always put the words to it, right? That they're like, it just felt gross. It just felt icky, and I wasn't sure why. And then I found your work and I was like, oh, it needs to be decolonized, and or it's, you know, it's appropriation or it's extraction. And so yeah, I think we definitely see a ton of that in coaching, a ton of that in spiritual spaces, a ton of that in personal development, and even the whole industry of coaching in general really is a replication of Indigenous practices of like going to an elder for guidance, right? Like an elder is the original coach or an oracle or a seer. And so it's just interesting how it's been packaged up and then, you know, bottled up and sold and almost sold back to us from, you know, by the ancestors of the people who stole it and forbid it in the first place. So it's
Yes.
really interesting, especially when people are sort of bottling up and trying to sell. I mean, all of it's really comes from many Indigenous cultures, but specifically when we see yeah, Indigenous medicines and practices and ways of knowing being repackaged and sold, even the concept of gratitude, that's something that is so was so deeply ingrained in me from growing up on the reserve, and is part of Haudenosaunee culture to have a good mind. So this whole concept of mindset work was not new to me, because it was always drilled into us the importance of a good mind. And so we would literally start every day with gratitude, with going through and greeting all of creation with our thanks and our acknowledgments. So it's just interesting to like buy it and read it and ingest it from a colonial lens. But I think I also didn't have the language to say, to recognize that or to say that that's what was happening when I was first getting into these spaces.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the beautiful thing and one of the pluses I love about the social media space. And honestly, I learned so much through, I think Black Lives Matter started in 2018, the marches start, but really took off in 2020 and it was more mainstream necessary shifts and changes. But I learned so much just listening during that time and not centering myself in the conversation and just like listening. And you just take in some of that language and it just resonates. It sits with you in a certain place. It has a vibration to it. And you're like, yes, that's the language of like my soul, of my work as well. But that integration of it, right? Not just taking it, extracting it, bringing it back out to the world. It's like integrating it, living it, being, exemplifying it, and then leading with it. That full grain, full circle, I should say. You speak very beautifully too. So I'm glad that you're able to host these conversations too, because they're not comfortable and not a lot of people can. Indigenous or not, it's, when you feel protective of something, when you've been impacted by something, it's not the easiest when you have that, epigenetics kind of coming in too, right? Like this, like ancestral cellular stuff that we're dealing with too. Like even talking to us, I can feel my heart getting like
Yeah.
picking up. And, this is where I wanted to talk to you too, because the labor, like even just like the labor around Halloween and people are like, why can't I dress my kid in like an Indian costume in Halloween? I was like, because we couldn't until 1996, right? Like, because we couldn't. It's not, or like they can wear a samurai costume, but they can't wear this. But you weren't sent to an Indian hospital if you know what I mean, if you wore your regalia. And I think this is where we're at. We're in that pendulum swing. It's like this is so fresh, so new. And so what I find is, I personally will stand up for racism online and like correct behavior and try to educate where I can, but there is like a lot of labor to it. And a lot of Indigenous people are done with that. They're like, I'm done with the labor. And so, this is your body of work, but it is laborious as well. So, what is that journey like for you? How do you take care of yourself? And like, do you find it laborious or is it completely energizing for you?
Yeah. Well, thank you for acknowledging that and bringing this question up. I mean, you nailed it. It is absolute labor, and it obviously when it's close to home and you feel it in your bones and you feel it in your DNA. It's tough. It's tough work. It's the most challenging work that I've ever done for sure, especially because there's so many layers to it. Obviously there's like the obvious layer, which is like, is this gonna offend or upset or make people uncomfortable? And of course, parts of it are, and for many people it is, no matter what you do. I personally speak to and focus on the people that are open and do want to learn and do want to do better and be better. And I also always lead with saying that I'm on this journey with you. I'm not, these are some words that I've also said. These are some ways that I've also operated in my business that, I am unlearning too. And so I think leading with that really helps, and it helps people sort of drop their guard. But the work is always going to be super emotional labor. And so that's why I get very passionate too. And then the other layer of it is, and I think what hurts the most, which I think we were also going to touch on, is like when your own people don't like what you're doing, when Indigenous people see, there's even comments on my ad for the ebook, being like decolonization, isn't a metaphor. Decolonization isn't work you should be making money on. Our elders warned us about people trying to capitalize on this. And there's people that don't like what I'm doing that are from Indigenous country. And that also adds a layer of pain, and is another thing to move through. So it is a lot. And this is why I'm so passionate about the fact that reciprocity needs to be there. When people talk about like, no, we shouldn't be charging money for this work. This is the hardest work I've ever done. Absolutely, we should be compensated for doing this work. Anyone who works, and I do this in my full-time job as well. I work in an Indigenous relations office for a university, and same thing there. It's a ton of emotional labor. So I absolutely think reciprocity helps, and receiving, an energetic exchange, whether it's monetary or another exchange, is super important. Taking breaks, and yes, especially somatic care, like moving my body. If I'm super activated, I'll do like shaking or tapping to just sort of move the energy through my body. I did a lot of that when that whole like debate was happening about the word matriarch. That whole thing was super activating. And then I also try to meditate every day and do my own gratitude in my language. It's called the Ohondogari Wadekwa, and it's the words before all else. And this is something that one of my cultural counselors, who unfortunately passed away really suddenly, but before he passed, I was trying to reconnect more with the culture. And I said, where do I start? Like, I want to learn our ways. And he said, why don't you start with the Ohondogari Wadekwa? Like, you know it from start your day every day by reading it and go through and give thanks to all creation, and it also will help me like pick the language back up. And so I've been doing that every day since, or almost every day, and that is so healing. And when I start my day with that versus when I don't start my day with that and then I just rush straight, as we sometimes do, rush straight into things. I slept in, whatever. Such a big difference in how my day goes and how my energy is. So I've really learned the importance of that. And obviously, I do a lot of smudging to clean my energy, cleanse my energy. But I also, in my business, I take breaks, and sometimes I don't always talk about decolonizing coaching. I talk about business growth and money and manifestation. And that for me is also a way to protect my energy. Like, it's one of my other passions is helping people be empowered around money, but it's also a strategic break for me energetically and emotionally from always focusing on this one topic, because I think I could get very angry, I could get very bitter, and I could get burnt out, which I've seen happen to a lot of friends and colleagues who are in sort of like social justice work, anti-racism spaces, and I don't want that to happen. I want this to be sustainable long term.
Yeah.
So yes, very intentional about like self-care and breaks and all of that.
Yeah, I love we both did self-care this morning. I saw on Instagram. I'm like, look
Yeah.
at us. Look at us.
So smart.
Entrepreneurs, like, yeah, I know. I feel you. And I have a lot of friends in the
Yeah.
social justice space, and the compassion fatigue is real, and then the purpose is real. Like, there's a driving force that we know this change is necessary. Okay, it is going to be me. And then it's like, how do I take care of myself? One thing I wanted to hit on too, because I've seen it a lot, and part of my self-care this morning, I'm going to recommend this book to you. It's so, so good. It's called Restoring the Kinship Worldview. And I was reading a story from a woman from Stolo Nation, which is out here in the Fraser Salish region. And she said she was the community manager for 6 years, and she did her thesis on like Indigenous health governance. And she said one of the most hurtful and shocking things was when her own people didn't support the work or weren't ready for it. And, in this time of like reclamation, I think there's a lot of confusion at the community level as well. There's a lot of restoring work, and they're focusing on it in community and then kind of like moving it outwards. But I just wanted to validate for you. I've seen it myself. I just read it this morning. So sign your sign that does come up, right? I've been teaching a little bit about lateral violence in my declaration program, which is a term I heard in the First Nations health governance space, where, with the assimilation process, when the government has us fighting for the dollar in the middle of the table, and you're in that survival instinct,
Yeah.
family lines be damned, right? And so it creates this culture of like infighting and lateral violence to get what we need for necessity and survival. And
Yeah.
so, and I think too, it's good to have some sort of discourse and very variety of different perspectives, as long as everyone's open to each other's perspectives and not just thinking like
Mhm.
mine is the eye and lens that we need to see this through, right?
Yeah, so true.
Yeah. Well, I am glad that you are doing that work. Now, I wonder too, as we start to move into this other area of work that I want to touch on too, around the money, because I too, it's not just in our ancestral line, but it's also in the healing art space, in the wellness space. There's a lot of wounds around money and being compensated for our heart-centered, people-centered work.
Mhm.
What has your journey been like with that? Because you teach on money, right? So this is a big, big offering of yours as well.
Yeah. Oh goodness. Yes, a journey is a good way to describe it because it has been a journey and it is an ongoing journey. It's been very layered for me. The pieces around, I think for one, just reconciling with money itself and realizing money itself is just a tool, it's a resource, and really framing it as a resource has been really helpful for me. Because I, like many other Indigenous folks and folks who have been oppressed sort of in the name of money, in the greed for money, and hoarding, um, they have of course, like a really bad taste in their mouth, as did I, around like money, because it's so much harm and damage has been done to us in the name of money. And so just reconciling with money and really neutralizing money and realizing, oh, right, it is a resource. And wouldn't it be great if we could all go back to living in longhouses or teepees and living in community and just, trading and helping each other out? Like, as much as that would be wonderful, that's not the reality of the current society we live in. And it's not likely to be anytime soon. So we do need a resource. We do need the resource that is money if we're going to not only thrive and survive for ourselves, but this is actually a resource that if it's in our hands, if it's in my hands, it can do a lot of good. It can actually serve my community. And I think as Indigenous peoples, especially, we're naturally giving people. We naturally want to take care of our community and our family and extended family. And so I'm just so passionate that, especially if you're a person who cares about the healing of others, whether you're Indigenous or not, I know that money's going to do good things in your hands. And there really is such a strong narrative out there of like in the social work spaces, in the social justice spaces, in the healing spaces, that it's somehow bad and wrong to make money. If you're really here to help people, it shouldn't be about the money. But the thing is, your life is going to be all about the money when you don't have it,
It is so true.
right?
That's a tweetable moment, as Oprah calls it. Like, I hope you have that quoted somewhere. Can you say that again?
Yeah, well, it's actually, I gotta give credit. I think I heard it from another teacher who now I'm forgetting their name, but it's a white woman who said it, but it's so true. It's all about the money when you don't have until you have the money.
Yeah,
So it's funny because people will say that a lot. Well, I don't not money driven. It's not all about the money. It's not all about the money. But then every decision they make
I know.
is it's about the money. Like, oh, I would love to, take that course or go do that thing, but I don't have the money. I'd love to give back and do that, but I don't have the money. I'd love to, buy this gift for my friend or my niece or my nephew, but I don't have the money. I'd love to go out for dinner, but I don't have the money. Isn't your life then all about the money?
Yeah.
But when you have money in abundance, you get to make decisions. You get to most express who you actually are because you're not limited by the resource that we call money.
Yeah.
So that just reconciling that has been huge for me, doing a lot of work on self-worth, and also something that I'm currently working through is like fear of losing it. And this I found out was an ancestral trauma where I had somewhere in my line ancestors who were wealthy, who had lots of abundance for themselves and their community, and it was sort of like the rug was ripped out from under them, which obviously we know happened. And so there is that fear that's ancestral for me that I'm working through of like, it is safe to have abundance and it's not going to be, no one can take it away. And even if they do, there's always more where that came from because the creator is my source of wealth, not one certain person or job or client. And so, yeah, there's lots of elements to it, and I could talk about money all day. I'm really passionate about it because I just think so much good happens when we're well resourced.
Yeah. I did that trauma of money program years ago and I became a facilitator. I've only taught one thing on it in my membership, which just kind of lives there as a resource. But when I was looking at all the different money disorders I too have, when it's like harder to hold on to wealth,
Mhm.
it's just
Mhm.
kind of it doesn't stick around anyways kind of thing. You know what I mean? And so one of the big switches I had around it was redefining my definition of wealth. And I realized that every single time I had any kind of abundance, I would like give someone an opportunity, like hire someone or
Yeah.
hire someone
Yeah.
for a couple hours. And so then my definition of wealth became I know I'm wealthy when I'm able to provide other people with opportunities. And then that became, I kind of have a career now where I could be like little Danielle in my room and like do readings in my room, or I can do this big thing that I'm kind of doing over here. And sometimes I romanticize about doing the little thing over here because it would be really simple life. But then over here, I'm able to give so many people opportunities that also feels really good. And yes, it is more stressful, a lot more work, but it feels more abundant. Like we
Mhm.
can hire people or, just give other people opportunities. But I love thinking of money as, just another resource as well, which of course it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can, yeah, exactly. We can support others. We can vote with our dollar, as I like to say. So we can buy from the local small business instead of the big corporation because we don't have to worry about the, $10 difference in price. And
Yeah.
I love to, it's my goal now to fill my closet with all Indigenous designers and beautiful clothing that is made ethically, that's made by Indigenous artists. That's one of my favorite ways to steward my wealth. And yeah, supporting the businesses I want to see win, supporting the people I want to see win. It's really, really powerful what we can do and what positive changes we can make when we're equipped with the resource.
Yes. Okay, so there's a question that's coming up in my mind because I don't know how to talk about this, but I feel like you do. Because I'm like, I think Emily's
Okay.
the one that will be able to kind of talk about this. So, for the listeners who are non-Indigenous, which there are many at Spirit School, I've been around for a long time, can you explain like why it's important? Like, because I share a lot about Indigenous artisans and stuff like that as well. I'll always use every opportunity to give exposure. But I would love to hear how, if you could describe, like, how does it help and support Indigenous healing when you do support Indigenous businesses?
Yeah, good question. I mean, for one, it honors Indigenous sovereignty and us and our communities being able to make a living, make a way for ourselves in doing something that, and for many Indigenous artisans and designers, they're they're making art and they're doing beadwork and they're doing designs that actually was stripped away from their parents and grandparents and ancestors. So that in itself is them doing an act of reclamation. You are then participating in that reclamation, and then therefore it becomes an act of reconciliation and creating that repair. So it's supporting them in doing something that is so healing and validating and just healthy for them personally, but also, of course, then the money is going to benefit them. It's going to benefit their communities, which, I mean, we could go on and on about just the way that we've economically been disadvantaged and still are disadvantaged in so many ways. There's a really good book called Indigenomics, and I'm forgetting the name of the author. I think it's Carol something or other, but Indigenomics, it's really, really powerful. And it explains exactly how Indigenous folks have been systemically excluded from participating in the economy, but how powerful we are when we create our own economy and what good happens for everybody. So supporting Indigenous businesses and artists obviously helps play into that and just reverse some of the multitude of damage that's been done from colonization and all the barriers that are in place for us accessing wealth and sovereignty. So yeah, it's super, super important.
Yes. You're definitely the right person to answer that. That's
I hope
beautiful.
I
If
did
I
a
get a
good job.
clip out of this, like that's going to be the clip because you're right. It's like, I go to the Indigenous Women Marketplace like on Facebook and like I'll buy $200 custom pants, like ribbon pants. I got these beautiful, you saw my
Yeah,
ribbon pants.
ribbon
They're so
band.
beautiful. I was
So
obsessed. I
nice.
was like,
Yeah.
and like yeah, 200 for pants for sure. Like that's a really but it felt so good. She's in a small
Yes.
community. This is her art. It's not cheap importing this to like Haida Gwaii, you know what I mean? And it, I love how you described it, and that's exactly how I think it should be described in the future. So please capture that. It's beautiful. I agree. As I have Spirit School now, I have like a physical school and location. It's been really interesting trying to experiment with it. And my latest experiment, because I'm writing a book recreating mediumship right now, 11 Indigenous Principles for Spirit Communication, because mediumship is very colonized. So that's a
Mhm.
totally different podcast episode. My audience may be surprised to hear that, but you'll read about it in my book I'll point it out and restore balance like where possible around it. But
Yeah.
one thing that I'm kind of doing is I'm having Indigenous leaders come in, female Indigenous leaders, and males, of course, too, if they want to come in and host their workshops and like share their medicine as a way to kind of like get that Indigenomics going. And I think about the community at large around here and how many people romanticize indigenism and incorporate some of those practices into their own offerings. And I feel like this is such a great way to get them to restore balance and come back into full circle by supporting an indigenous teacher and coming in. And I'm surprised that it's not, and I'm surprised because much like you said earlier, the people that I was hoping would participate in this like didn't. And that's
Yeah.
been my realization as well, because I see different circles and stuff that definitely have indigenous overtones.
Yeah.
and I'm like, come to that circle, like this is karma,
Yeah.
like this is good karma, whatever language you want to put into it. You described it a lot better, but like this is one of the reasons why I want to do it, to give people an opportunity to restore that balance. And I'm just surprised that that consideration isn't there.
Yep.
Totally
Yes.
different rant. I just went on
Yeah.
a totally different rant.
I wish I had something smart to add to that, but yeah, no, that's unfortunately oftentimes we see people they have, and it comes back to the colonization being so the ideology behind colonization that white is superior, that's internalized by all of us. And so unlearning that really takes intentionality, really takes practice, really takes a ton of inner work. Like, talk about a growth portal. This is it. Decolonizing yourself is it. But because people have that belief, whether it's conscious or subconscious, is so strongly ingrained that our leaders, our people that we look to as authorities, those should be white folks. And so even when there's an opportunity to learn from authentic indigenous sources about our ways and our cultures, we find the uptake is like nowhere near where it should be. And
Exactly.
yet you'll run out and you'll take a spirit circle mediumship ceremony program with a white woman in a heartbeat, and you'll pay 4 times as much as you would have paid to Danielle or an authentic source. And so that's something that is obviously a source of frustration as well. And I'm glad that you named it, because it's important to talk about. That's how we start to change things, right?
And I say that without shame, and I want people to know that like shame has
Yeah.
kept Indigenous people oppressed. Like it's not about shaming. It's like if you feel something and you feel a certain
Yeah.
way, maybe just do that internal reflection work on, am I doing this? Like, have I seen this? Has this it? And then it's not about like apologizing, just do better. When you know better, you do better, right?
Exactly.
And sometimes these extractive behaviors are natural because they're a natural way of being in society. It's how our society is kind of set up. So it's just meant to like jog something in the heart and just take an Indigenous perspective on it and then just do what you will with that information. That's kind of up to you and between you and the creator. But
Yeah,
it's that internalized work that's got to be done, right?
absolutely.
Yeah, we can talk about this forever.
Yeah,
So,
all day.
seeds of
Yeah.
wealth. I know, I'm like, I can keep you. Maybe we need a separate podcast.
You'll
But I
come on
really,
my podcast and then we'll talk all about decolonizing mediumship. That would be
there
awesome.
you go. There you go. You have an amazing body of work. You have a podcast. Your Instagram's really great. You share a lot of beautiful content on there. So I'll have all that linked down below. Seeds of Wealth, I know you're running in January, which is, decolonizing your relationship with money and your experience with money, which I highly recommend that you look at. So we'll have all that available to you. But, is there any last words that you want to say to the Spirit School audience? Any last words of wisdom, how they can find you, all that fun stuff? Please drop that now.
Thank you. The thing that's coming up for me is just thank you, just gratitude. Thank you for opening your hearts, opening your minds. If you made it all the way through this episode, there was some uncomfortable topics that we touched upon today, right? And so it takes a lot to open your heart and open your ears and mind to that. So really just thank you. And yeah, as Danielle mentioned, we'll link all the things, but the easiest way to find me is just emilyannbrant.com, my website. And I hang out a lot on Instagram, which is Emily Ann Brant, and it's Ann with an E.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been a joy to get to know you better. And I know that the Spirit School audience will love this episode. So thank you.
Thank you.